Hello students, welcome to EPG Pathshala. Today we shall be talking about the applications of remote sensing and GIS in wildlife monitoring. So far you all have studied what is remote sensing, what is GIS, what is GPS, what are their applications in the field of environmental sciences, as well as their applications in specific environmental domains such as coastal zone management, land resources, as well as disaster management, besides land use activities and air pollution control. So, in this module we shall be talking about how remote sensing and GIS can be used for wildlife monitoring. The conventional methods that are used for wildlife monitoring, they are very time taking, difficult, as well as most of the wildlife habitats are located on inaccessible areas. So, the remote sensing can prove to be a very valuable tool for studying these by means of site suitability analysis, habitat mapping, as well as modeling the location and movement of wildlife. So, at the beginning of the module, let us talk about wildlife resources. These wildlife resources constitute a vital link in the survival of human species and have been a subject of much interest and research all over the world. Presently, the wildlife habitats are under severe pressure and a large number of species of wild fauna have become endangered. Wildlife is treated as an inexhaustible genetic resource, the conservation of which becomes essential. Human induced undesirable changes such as land encroachment to wildlife habitat, pollution and introduction of invasive species pose serious threat to wildlife health and richness. Hence, in order to restore wildlife habitat, fragmentation and to prevent further local and global extinction of any species, it is imperative to understand and carry out comprehensive study of the wildlife population and pattern. But most of the wildlife habitats are generally located in inaccessible areas where accessibility is not easy because of difficult terrain. Also, the study of wildlife conservation and management with the help of conventional methods happens to be tough, time taking, risky and requires lot of resources. Further, expressing and measuring biodiversity, including study of organisms and their biotic and abiotic components, happens to be intricate because of the versatile nature of biodiversity. Remote sensing can answer these problems as a number of strategies for wildlife studies, including investigation of biodiversity, wildlife habitation mapping, as well as the movement and modeling can be executed with the help of remote sensing and inventory database. Now, coming to our next topic, that is wildlife management and India. India contains about 172 species of animals that are considered to be globally threatened by IUCN. This constitutes about 2.9% of the world's total number and includes about 53 species of mammals, 69 species of birds, 23 species of reptiles and 3 species of amphibians. The extinction is threatening almost all the species, but most of the time smaller animals such as bats and rodents face this threat more than other animals. Most recent extinctions can be attributed either directly or indirectly to anthropogenic inputs as well as environmental change. These factors in turn have affected the reproductive rate of endangered species and their adaptability to changing environmental conditions. So, we shall be discussing some of the projects that have been launched by the Government of India for conservation of wildlife. The first in this is Project Tiger, which has been done because the huge demand for tiger bones destined for use in oriental traditional medicine outside of India is an added threat to India's tiger population. The Project Tiger was launched on 1st April with the following objectives: to maintain a viable population of tigers in India for scientific, economic, aesthetic, cultural and ecological values, and to preserve for all times areas of biological importance as a national heritage for the benefit, education and enjoyment of the people. At the beginning of the project, 9 tiger reserves were created, but presently there are 50 tiger reserves covering a total area of 71,000 127 kilometers squares. The next is the conservation of black buck or the Indian antelope. The black buck, scientifically known as Antelope cervicapra or Indian antelope, is exclusive to the Indian subcontinent. This black buck was listed under Schedule 1 of the Wildlife Protection Act 1972, and the states of Punjab and Haryana honored it as their state animal. Presently, there are 5 wildlife sanctuaries in Punjab. The Bishnoi community does not allow felling of trees as well as killing of all wild animals including birds, and this has resulted in the community gaining importance for conservation practices. Further, the strict policy of local cooperation and non-interference towards the local wildlife has provided protection to peafowl, partridges, hare, jungle cats, nilgai and other wild animals. The next is the great Indian bustard, which is scientifically also called as Ardiotis nigriceps. It is the state bird of Rajasthan and an indicator of the health of the grassland ecosystem of Indian plains. In the early 1980s, 5 states undertook conservation measures for the great Indian bustard and 8 protected areas were created. However, the state of these bustard has deteriorated sharply in the last few years. The major problems that face the survival of the great Indian bustard include habitat destruction, which is due to the rise of many domestic animals that cause disturbance during the breeding season, and habitat has also been lost due to the change in land use practices such as conversion of grasslands and wastelands to crop fields. Another factor is poaching, which is quite popular in the desert area of Rajasthan, as well as the mismanagement of already created bustard sanctuaries. The Bombay Natural History Society is a pioneer in promoting the conservation of great Indian bustard in India. Coming to the main core of the module as to what is the role of remote sensing in wildlife mapping. Remote sensing can provide viable solutions for studies related to biodiversity, habitation mapping and monitoring. Some of the areas where remote sensing can be useful for wildlife studies include the following. For example, revision and updating of stock maps, fire risk zonation, planning response routes, protected area management, site suitability analysis for afforestation, fire line and management, soil and water conservation, mapping wildlife corridors, habitat suitability mapping, prediction analysis, change detection analysis, mapping various required resources for wildlife, real time tracking, population mapping, as well as developing web portal for particular wildlife. So, now coming to the topic of applications of remote sensing in wildlife mapping in detail. As you all know, remote sensing is capable of providing uniform, consistent spatial observation data at a wider scale domain. The images and photographs that are obtained from remote sensing help greatly in the investigation of physical conditions. It can be further enhanced for better accuracy using remotely sensed data and field study, that is the multi-stage approach that we discussed. Remote sensing can be classified based on either direct approach or indirect approach. The direct approach suggests direct observation of spatial features, objects or communities using satellites or airborne sensors, using high resolution spatial sensors and hyperspectral sensors. The indirect parameters are dependent on the environmental parameters such as land use, land cover, species composition, etc., obtained from remotely sensed data as surrogate for precise measurement of the potential species varieties and patterns. Wide varieties of satellite data sets are available commercially, that include digital data sets obtained from Landsat 5, thematic mapper, linear imaging self scanning sensors known as LIS3, Indian remote sensing satellite series, SPOT, that is Système probutoire pour l'observation de la Terre, and multispectral data. The thematic sensors help in the availability of multitemporal data with replicated coverage of 16 days for examining temporal changes occurring in the wildlife habitat and communities. The recent series of Indian remote sensing satellites or SPOT series satellites come with the advantage of stereo data acquisition competence with off-nadir viewing potential of a higher spatial resolution of almost 6 meter in IRS 1C 1D panchromatic data to 10 meters in spot pan data. The sensors list 3 onboard IRS 1C 1D satellites give multispectral data obtained in 4 bands of visible and near infrared as well as short infrared zone. List 3 images contain region of almost 124 or 141 kilometers for the very near infrared bands and about 133 to 148 kilometers for the shortwave infrared bands perceived from an altitude of about 817 kilometers in IRS 1C to 780 kilometers in IRS 1D with a recovering coverage of 25 days. The very near infrared bands have spatial resolution of 24 meters and shortwave infrared has nearly 71 meters of resolution. The spatial resolution of list 3 of IRS satellite series and multispectral data are superior to Landsat thematic mappers. In order to conserve and manage wildlife system, many countries maintain an inclusive forest account database of protected areas. These vegetation inventory database are important for the wildlife studies as they are extensive at comparatively larger spatial scales, maybe 1:20,000, and they reduce the cost of production and are generally allocated in convenient GIS format. Generally, different management and conservation strategies cover only particular species and protected areas, which happens to be only 5.19% of the total Earth's land surface. Many of these biological reserves and protected areas are designed for aesthetic purpose and tourist attraction rather than wildlife conservation purpose. In these areas, sometimes wildlife is exposed to unsuitable land practices such as grazing livestock, agriculture, mining, etc. Poaching of some species makes them vulnerable and sometimes some diseased and invasive species invade the wildlife population. Therefore, thriving wildlife resource requires upkeeping of optimal conditions within wildlife reserve as well as outside it. The successful management and conservation of wildlife reserve can be carried out well if there is complete availability of information and relevant knowledge about the spatial and temporal distribution of wildlife population. The successful mapping of wildlife distribution can be accomplished using satellite remote sensing. For example, coral reef mapping of 9 reef classes was done with about 37% accuracy with Landsat thematic mapper data, 67% with aerial photography and 81% with airborne CASI hyperspectral scanner by Mumbai and his co-workers in 1998. Thermal scanners have been used to measure the population of deer, elk, bison and moose in Canada by comparing ground counts with aerial count, as thermal scanners are known to determine the presence or absence of those species which are not easily observable during certain climatic conditions. Error can sometimes occur during thermal scanning because of the sunlight heated objects and presence of non-target animals. Many of the species like earthworms and termites are known to cause interference because of the roughness caused either by their exoskeleton or by their impact to the soil surface. Certain species which readily modify their environment hamper the applicability of remote sensing satellite, as the sensors are incapable to capture the impact of such species on the environment. In such conditions, radar can be helpful to map such animals as it is sensitive to microtopography. Also, integrated normalized difference vegetation index, that is called as NDVI, or greenness index, that is a measure of the health of vegetation, was reported to be associated with biome averages of net primary productivity. It has also been demonstrated that there exists sharp line relationship between vegetation indices observed from the satellite and seasonal primary production. For example, this figure shows a statistical model to predict animal location and movement for Miriam's turkey. In this figure, GPS satellites and radio tags provided key data on animal location and movement of Miriam's turkey. This data was useful to derive statistical models of space and resource use. Similarly, several studies have been carried out which demonstrate the relationship between NDVI and biomass production, but fewer studies have been carried out to show the linkage between NDVI and wildlife. Since more than 3 decades, remote sensing has also been widely used to confine the distribution of zones appropriate for specific wildlife habitat. Landsat multispectral scanner was used for mapping suitable areas for prairie chicken by Canon in 1982. VSMI in 1983 used it to map snow cover to detect south facing snow free slopes which form winter habitat of alpine ibex. Landsat thematic mapper was used to map wetland suitable for foraging wood stork, and it was also used by other workers for mapping suitability of land for deer identification. Landsat thematic mapper was used to evaluate the availability of habitat for wood thrush. These studies relied on the vegetation map acquired from remote sensing as the sole explanatory variable, but land suitability for wildlife may be found out using more than one factor for better representation. Now, coming to our next topic, that is the application of GIS in wildlife mapping. So far, you all know that GIS is a computer based system that is designed for capturing, managing, manipulating, analyzing, modeling and displaying spatially georeferenced data and for solving complex management problems. The GIS helps in easy management of natural and man-made resources at wider scales extending from local to global. GIS is capable of overlaying information from different thematic maps depending on user specific logic and derived map outputs. Because of the wide array of GIS applications, task defined systems have been created which include engineering specific land based information, generic thematic, statistical and property lot mapping, environmental planning systems and image processing systems related with remotely sensed data and Landsat. In GIS, the attribute data are stored in relational database and geospatial data are saved in map layers, map themes and map coverages. These layers, geographically referenced to one another, happen to be the foundation of GIS. The gist of the map layers refers to spatial as well as the attribute data. GIS database sourced map coverages and GIS analysis based results can be displayed and printed in maps, tables and figures and shared by various GIS software packages. The figure here explains the mechanism of GIS in which any input data or query after thorough analysis is displayed and reported in the form of information. GIS easily helps in creating maps that cannot be created by using traditional cartographic method. Moreover, the GIS software packages offering modeling tools can easily create measurements and analyze the attribute data. The information in GIS is stored digitally, hence it is easily accessible for evaluation and analysis, making it easy to be shared among wildlife managers and the public. GIS particularly offers potential to enhance the accuracy and precision and long term inexpensive basic actions of wildlife management and conservation, such as inventorying, analysis, monitoring, planning and communication. However, GIS sometimes faces basic issues such as in the case of determining if GIS is suitable for a given situation, finding out which data layer is essential and adequate to achieve the planned task. These basic problems need to be resolved before taking any action. The constrictions and limitations of GIS applicability consist of the simplification of data for mixed areas due to inadequate scale resolution, data incoherence from integrating data from different sources without any regard to reliability of each source, as well as the lack of quality data. In the context of wildlife management, a GIS enables wildlife distribution, movement and habitat use patterns and processes to be mapped and analyzed, which can provide us valuable information for the development of management strategies. Recently, the rapid development and technological improvements in GIS as well as in remote sensing techniques and GPS have significantly increased their availability and utility in ecological management and research. Subsequently, the use of GIS for mapping, monitoring, analyzing and modeling the nesting behavior and habitat of wildlife population has become increasingly widespread. For example, the studies have used GIS to determine the distribution and extent of habitats selected by nesting animals by various researchers, and also to identify the nesting habitats that are potentially available. Wildlife management actions are ideally based on intimate information of natural landscape, land use and mass of interior and exterior threats to it. GIS and other similar types of computer based technologies such as remote sensing provide the means to acquire huge amount of geospatial data and offer powerful analysis tools for understanding the linkages between different types of data and help us in manipulating these data over larger areas for various development goals for wildlife. Further, geographic information on the population scattering of wildlife forms a basic source of data in wildlife management. Radio telemetry and satellites have used to evidence the distribution of a diversity of animal species by various workers. Aerial inspection process based on the direct observation increased by use of photography have been used to map the distribution of a range of mammals, birds and sea turtles and marine mammals by various researchers from time to time. GIS mapping is progressively being used for wildlife density mapping and dispersion mapping derived from ground observation or aerial survey. Habitat studies based on GIS commonly merge information on vegetation type or different area descriptor with other land features reflecting the reserve base factors and other significant factors. For example, a model for Florida scrub jay developed by Brinegar and his team included vegetation type and soil drainage to differentiate primary habitation, secondary habitation and unsuitable areas. A GIS based model was also developed by Hare and Queen in 1993 to categorize the prospective nesting habitation for cranes in Minnesota area of USA. Now, this figure shows the example for suitability mapping and it is an overall sketch for GIS based suitability mapping. Wildlife habitat suitability study involves an analysis of the complex interrelationship among various environmental factors that exist over a geographical area. Each model includes various factors such as forest type, topography, water resource or the distance from human activity centers. The study applies each model to GIS in order to identify the most suitable and moderately suitable habitats for wildlife. For example, this figure shows the application of GIS in disease outbreak, and in the Bali Mountain National Park in south central Ethiopia, most of the wolves were split into 3 linked subpopulations: Saneti Plateau, Murbawa and the Webb Valley. In the late August of 2008, researchers in the Webb Valley found dead Ethiopian wolves and the laboratory tests confirmed the case of rabies. It was then added to a rapidly rising GIS layer of the area in order to understand the likely origin of the outbreak and the direction of its dispersal through the population. The circle numbers in this figure represent the numbers of wolves that had been vaccinated at each trapping location. The carcasses found to the south of the vaccination points were caused by a second rabies outbreak. Another example is spatial analysis of or modeling, which has been shown in the figure, where the future impact of white nose syndrome on the bats and their hibernation sites has been discussed. Bat Conservation International created a geodatabase of critical hibernation sites and mapped the likely spread of the disease using the GIS. A few past projects had focused on developing geospatial data sets, but no long term plan was in place for setting GIS as a part of the customary operations. Now, GIS technology is also helping the biologists to improve the understanding of the threats prevailing in the wildlife communities. Spatial analysis of the affected areas and possible future spread is essential for focusing efforts to increase awareness and endorse vigilance. So, dear students, I hope that by the end of this module, you would be able to understand the importance of wildlife, the projects that are being taken up for wildlife management in India, as well as the applications that the remote sensing and GIS have in wildlife monitoring and mapping. So far, you would also be able to appreciate the fact as to how remote sensing and GIS play a crucial role in site suitability analysis, habitat mapping or other dynamic models for wildlife conservation and management. Also, we have studied how remote sensing and GIS have advantages over conventional methods of field studies. Although the technologies for remote sensing and GIS are being increasingly used for wildlife conservation and management, still its application in developing countries is not that up to the mark due to certain lack of data or softwares or hardwares availability. However, still the countries are making quite progress and developing various projects for the conservation of wildlife. So, the future lies in developing dynamic models for conservation of the wildlife resources of any country. I hope you all have benefited from this module. Thank you.